Hi, everybody. My name is Antonio Diaz, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Life in Time. And we thank you for you all to join us on this very special webinar that we're hosting here. It's been a minute since we hosted. It's been a minute since we've hosted a webinar, and I know a lot of you are kind of sick of Zoom webinars and virtual panels, but for today's panel here, I figured it would be very, very special to um, talk to this lovely, lovely folks that we have here related to the Palestinian diaspora, and we have this is amazing because this is a very like transnational conversation that we're having live, and with us, I want to introduce Jibrael Younes, who is a filmmaker and writer based in Los Angeles. We have the wonderful Reem Assil, who is the owner, chef, and activist of Reem's California in Oakland and San Francisco. And then we have the wonderful Fadi Kattan, who is tuning in from Bethlehem in Palestine, who's the chef and owner of Fauda restaurant in Bethlehem and opening up a new restaurant in London, who he's going to be telling us a little bit about in a little bit. So thank you all for tuning in. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Jibrail, who will be moderating today's discussion around the Palestinian diaspora, and we're going to go into all sorts of interesting topics related to food, to the culture, to the region, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A at the end as well. But thank you so much for tuning in, and Jibrail, take it away, buddy.
Yeah, thank you, Antonio. I think we're all really excited to be here. And Reem and Fadi, I'm so excited to be talking to you guys right now. This is so exciting for me. But yeah, so let's just sort of set up our conversation here. I'll introduce myself a little bit. My name is Jibrael Younes. I grew up in the American Midwest. My parents are from Nazareth and Haifa. And I think the reason food is so important to me, I think maybe this is sort of common across the diaspora, but food's the main way I've connected with my own heritage, my own identity, my own cultural identity. And it's just the more I've gotten into it, the more attention I've paid to it, the more important it's become for me, and the more special it's become to me. And through eating at restaurants like both of yours, Patty, I haven't eaten yours yet, but one day. But through eating, I had such a special moment at Reem's in the Mission when I was there in San Francisco, and it was this feeling you get. It feels every restaurant that does it correctly feels like home to me, and I think that's sort of been the big marker for me and maybe for a lot of us, which is in the absence of a place that feels truly like home, you have food that makes you feel at home, and that's been such an important part of my journey and such a grounding touchstone for me throughout my life. And so with that, we have Reem, and we're going to get into a bunch of different topics. We're going to talk about why identifying food is important. But first, I just wanted to give the opportunity to Reem, to Fadi, to talk about themselves, their journey through diaspora, and sort of their vision for food, their vision for what they're doing as activists. If they call, Reem, I know you identify as that, but I just wanted to give you guys the floor. So Reem, why don't we start with you? Can you sort of talk about your journey in the diaspora, where you're at now, what the vision is, go through all that?
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. Such a timely conversation given what's happening in the world today. For folks who are less familiar with my work, I am a Palestinian Syrian. I was born here in the US, although people are always surprised when they ask me where I'm from. I was born and raised in a very small suburb outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and my upbringing in a Palestinian and Syrian household was quite paradoxical. In the home, my parents immigrated here in the late 70s. My mom is Um, my family comes from a line of twice removed. So my grandmother is originally from Jaffa, and was a refugee in Gaza, where she met my grandfather. And then they were displaced in 1967. So my mom spent a good part of her childhood in Beirut, actually. They thought they were taking a vacation, and lo and behold, it became a very long vacation. And they, a decade worth of civil war in Beirut as a Palestinian was pretty traumatizing, but to have moved to the heart of, Americana culture in New England was quite a culture shock for them. So in my household, the culture, particularly Palestinian culture, was very, very strong. And then outside the household, it was very alienating. I went to a school that was predominantly white, and I was the ambiguous brown kid. And this was in the time of Oslo, the so-called peace process, the Gulf War, all through the media, the image of the Arab and the Palestinian was, the backwards terrorists. So needless to say, as a child and as a teenager, I wasn't forthright about my identity. In fact, the closest thing that people knew was Lebanon, so I just say, yeah, I'm Lebanese. And that continues to be the trend even today. It's like just easier to say you're Lebanese than to say you're Arab. And so I spent a lot of my childhood and my race consciousness around my Arab identity didn't really come until college. I had an affinity for social justice. My awakening was really in the context of fighting for the rights of Black and Brown communities here in the States. And, I've been to Gaza once. It was when I was 11, approaching 12 years old. So it was a very formative experience. But the thing that really connected the dots for me was that rural Mississippi, to me, looked just like Gaza. Like I was able to connect the dots of like, oh, there must be something bigger that is creating the conditions for my people, that is creating the same condition for Black and Brown communities here in the US. And so I pursued a career of social justice, and I found my way here to California, and went through many traumatic experiences. But to sort of make a long story short, really discovered food and my identity as a Palestinian in a California context. And, while I was pursuing a career in organizing on the front lines, in the workplace and in neighborhoods, food was always the thing that I came back to. Really discovering the foods of my Palestinian identity as an adult was pretty formative for me. And in 2010, I decided that I was going to leave that career and become a baker, to the demise of my immigrant parents, who were like, what is she doing? Why is she trying to be poorer and poorer by the day? And had an obsession with bread as kind of the connector to my identity, and became a baker. And 7 years later, opened up my bakery and restaurant that really celebrates the culture and the heritage of my people, but really through this gift of Arab hospitality. I really wanted to connect the work that I do here locally in communities to the roots of Arab hospitality and how it creates resilient communities. So I'll stop there. It's a very long journey, but that in a nutshell is kind of where I am today.
Yeah, and we can dig in more. You're also, I feel like I missed it, but you're also coming off of James Beard nom. You're a finalist, which is so exciting to see the community.
Thank you.
See the community.
I love to be the Susan Lucci of the James Beard Awards. Maybe one day I'll win it, but yes, it's a very important platform that I don't take for granted.
Yeah, and we have so many people in the chat saying where they're from. It's really exciting there's a lot of diversity here, which is so cool. And so moving to Fadi, you have a really interesting journey as well. I don't want to spoil it. I'll let you take it. but I know you were sort of born in France and then came back to Bethlehem. No, my bad. I'll let you tell.
Nah, it's more complicated. It's more complicated than that.
I'll let you tell.
No, actually, I was born in Bethlehem and raised in Bethlehem with quite a strong connection to France. My diaspora is a generation older than me. So basically, I come from a family that left Bethlehem in the early 1900s. On my mother's side, so my grandfather on my mother's side to France, and my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side to Japan. And they lived the diasporas of that time, which were more economic rather than political, but that had a political background because we were either at the end of the Ottoman Empire or the beginning of the British Mandate, depending on the two families, but where things like forced military service were being imposed on us by the Ottomans in preparation of the First World War. And the 1948 for me is not something that impacted my life directly, but rather it's something that impacted the composition of my family, because on my father's side, all of his uncles decided to stay abroad because they had lost everything. Even though we're not refugees, we come from Bethlehem. So, but they were business people. They had land in Jaffa, they had land in Ramla, they had land in and all of that was confiscated in the name of creating the state of Israel. and therefore, so I grew up with this identity of belonging a bit everywhere and nowhere. I mean, I grew up until 2000. I know my father was born in India. We were not Indian. And until 2000, where I actually went to India and went looking for the places where I grew up with the stories of my grandmother and grandfather working in Bombay and using Indian spices. And then that trickled down in the food of the house. I mean, when I grew up, having a Goan shrimp curry was just like having hummus. It was something I didn't think of, where did this come from? We had a very strong component of Italian cuisine at home, and it's because my dad's uncle and aunt had fallen in love with people in Alexandria in 1920 who were Italian, and we ended up having. So funnily enough, where it connects today, I still work with the butcher my grandparents used to work with. And one of the things I love doing there is cutting up some raw liver and sharing it with people, people I take to the butchers. And the first time I did this, the older gentleman looked at me with a smile and said, "Oh, we remember the story of Signora Anna Barbagallo, who used to come from Italy and get raw liver for her brother." So this is where my journey in diaspora comes. But then I left to do my studies in France. Studied in Paris, worked a bit in Paris and London, and I came back here in 2000. At the time, I was working for a hotel group. The idea was to see a bit what I could do, because I always had this obsession of we're not doing anything for Palestinian food in Palestine. Like there's something wrong. Like, how do we share? We have this fantastic food at home, but if you're a visitor to Palestine, we're feeding you at best a good mezze and mashaw, grilled meats, but that's at best. Very often we're feeding you, and it's because tourism was built on pilgrimage, etc. So I had this obsession of like, what can we do? I came here, of course, I chose to come back. So Reem was mentioning Oslo. I came back 4 months before the start of the second Intifada. It wasn't a very smart move if you were working in hospitality. And I think it was one of the saddest moments I went through, where I could feel really in 4 months, seeing that hope that Palestinians had. And I know today some people have can be very critical of this, but actually I think nobody can judge what Palestinians living here were feeling. But it was really this feeling of hope. Logically, etc., I agree. I mean, it was a scam, etc. But people had this like positive vibe. And then in 4 months' time, boom, I saw the other face of it. And so I didn't start my restaurant until in 2006, I organized the first Palestinian culinary competition. And I was shocked because the 5 finalist chefs, 4 of them were cooking things that had 0 local ingredients in them. And I was just like, wow, okay, you know what? There's something profoundly wrong with how we've lost pride in our food. And at the same time, those chefs on their breaks before they were competing were all telling me how great their mother's msakhan was and how fantastic the mansaf was at home. I was like, wait, guys, like, take that, put it in a plate, and you've got it right. Like, there's something there. And so 7 years ago, I started my restaurant, Fawda, in Bethlehem, where I simply did that. I took what my mother and my grandmother taught me. I still call my mother today every day and like, so I'm going to cook this. I'm going to deconstruct this. But tell me how you do it, and then I'm going to have a go at it. And I just put it in a plate. Now, why Fawda? And because actually that's how our grandmothers cook. That's how my grandmother cooked. My grandmother would either, like, farmers would come to her house on their way to the market with the produce of the day. It's not a fake image. Those old pictures of a Palestinian Hajjah with a big bag on her head with the produce. That's what Bethlehem looked like 30 years ago. And they would go from house to house on their way to the market and they'd sell their wara inab or their, whatever they had. That's how my grandmother cooked. You ask my grandmother at 7 in the morning, what are you cooking today? She'd be like, at 10, you'd hear somebody knock at the door and she'd be like, I'm cooking this, like literally. Oh. And that's where, that's what we've done with Fawda. Then London, we'll talk about London later, but basically London was in the line of this, of saying, how do we take Palestinian food and say it can be not only good when it's traditional, it inspires to do modern takes on it. Mm-hmm. It's not fixed. And that's where I think Diaspora has a very important role, because we look at things differently. There's a nostalgia attached to it that's different. Mm-hmm. I realize sometimes with people I talk to, if I dare say things like, Msakhan is not going to be grilled chicken, it's going to be chicken liver parfait that I'm going to do. People in the diaspora tend to get their teeth out, like, don't you dare do this. And it's because there's this whole memory attached to Msakhan that's very different. It's like, I realize how essential food has become to people as a connector, and sometimes, sadly, as a disconnector. I mean, Reem, when Reem, so I was lucky to have Reem reach out and say, I'd like you to write three sentences about my book. Can I send you the draft? And I was like, okay, you know what? I don't want to do this. In the beginning, I was like, why do I want to do this? I knew Reem, I knew what she was doing, but it was like, this is going to be another book with a recipe of Baba Ghanoush. Like, why am I going to do this? And I said, no, but I like her work, so I'll have a look at it. And literally, in Reem, that night, I think I hated you profoundly, because I stuck there and read the whole draft all night. I was so much into actually understanding the story of the diaspora, of what it means to be a Palestinian Syrian in America today, working with food, and what is the symbolism of each page you wrote in that book. The recipes, the stories, I mean, and then I disagree and agree with some of them, but it was just like, I mean, it was an insight. And of course, I was very happy to write those 3 little lines that were complicated then too, because it was a 10 paragraph thing, and then I had to make it into 3 lines. But it was great to see this, because those are all the voices we need to be heard today. That is what Palestinian cuisine is about. It's about Jibrael, you cooking whatever you cook in the morning, and Reem doing the same thing and sharing it and talking about it, and all of us arguing about who has the best olive oil and where it comes from. Because my olive oil comes from a land I know, your olive oil comes from a land that means a lot to you, but that you may not know because
Mm-hmm.
occupation allow you to visit it.
Mm-hmm.
So I can, criticize a certain farmer and have a go at them because I think their, olive oil has been oxidized or whatever, and I know that that same bottle for you
Means
means
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
means holy oil, and that's where this conversation is great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to highlight, Reem, your book Arabiya is so powerful and profound. I, encourage everyone to read it if they haven't. But one of the things that you talk about in the book, beyond what Fadi discussed, is sort of and it's one thing we've talked about a lot, which is like celebrating and showcasing the hospitality aspect. And before we get into our next section, I just want to give you a second to sort of bounce on that. And I think that's something that's so special, like the vibrant nature of our culture. I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about the hospitality aspect to what you do at Reem's and what you wrote about in your book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to backtrack just to react to Fadi. I mean, that thank you so much, Fadi. Like, that means so much. I think for me, writing the book Arabiya, like, I mean, there were so many reasons that I wrote it, but one of them that has been coming up for me more often now, having done my book tour, is like, I just literally wanted to build community. It's like we're all going through these experiences in isolation, and I only know my experience and my truth. And this book has opened avenues to compare notes. Like, did you feel that way? Oh, that's a different experience. Like, and I don't know, it's just been really magical. And I think, I honestly wanted to write a memoir, but they wanted a cookbook. So I gave them a little bit of both. And so, yeah, while the recipes are really important for me, I structured the book to follow the story. And so I just had to pick sort of the recipes that would fit in that format. And for me, expressing my Arab identity or my Palestinian identity or my Syrian identity, or all these intersections of my identity through food, is really a liberatory practice. It's the ability for me to express myself at my fullest with no restrictions, and to be able to cook my foods in the way that I interpret them at the moment that I interpret them. Like, my mtabbal, or these basic mezze dishes, they've gone through so much evolution, so they're not fixed either in my evolution as a chef. So I don't claim this is just like a snapshot of my life in this moment. So that's the recipes that you'll see, is like how I was inspired in that moment to make those dishes. So for me, expressing myself at its fullest it really roots back to this idea of hospitality, of connection, of humanity. Like, that is the thing and it's not, I wouldn't say it's specific to Palestinian people. We all have it in us, but because of the various conditions that a lot of our communities, particularly marginalized communities, have gone through, we haven't been able to express ourselves at our fullest. And so, yeah, we call it hospitality, we call it caring and connection, but it's really about liberation. Because I think that what we were trying to do at Reem's, and why I created it, was to kind of create a bubble, a snapshot of like, what does a space look like other than what we know outside those doors, where people can stand in their own dignity and be who they are, not at the expense of anybody else, And so that's what we tried to create at Reem's, is like, this is very strong in our Palestinian identity. It's our identity. When I talk about being Palestinian food or Palestinian identity, it's a political identity. It's a reaction to the world that we live in. But wouldn't it be cool to live in a world without those boundaries, and we could just be who we are and celebrate the roots that we came from, and that stuff is more fluid. And I think that's what we try to do at Reem's. Nothing is exclusionary. My food is as much Palestinian as it is California. You know, my cooks come from all parts of the world and their hands are on that food, and so that culture is displayed in the food, and I don't want it to be exclusionary in that way. I wanted it to be celebratory, and that's at sort of the root of the work that I do.
Yeah, I
So
think
that's a long-winded way of answering, in that like hospitality is a universal thing, and I'm just trying to peel back away these conditions of capitalism and colonialism and all of these things that are taking us away from ourselves. And particularly for Palestinians, that's something we do very, very well, that despite the odds, despite occupation, despite being, literally being peeled away from our homelands, not being able to go, that we're able to express that hospitality and that root of our culture. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's so beautiful, and it really carries with you, and it shows in your restaurant. And so I think that's a really good segue into sort of the first part of the meat of the discussion, which is, you know, I think that throughout Southwest Asia, North Africa, and then more specifically the Levant, a lot of the recipes, a lot of the food feels similar, I think, to a lot of, you know, to a more general and broad audience. And so I wanted to, before we dive into sort of the more meaty part of this conversation, just take a moment and ask both of you, in your view, what is Palestinian food? Like, can we just get a small 101 for the members of the audience? In your view, like, what do you think Palestinian food is? What makes it specific compared to the wider region? Fadi, we can start with you.
Jibrael, you just made it very meaty by using the word Levant. What is the Levant?
In my mind, it's Lebanon. I know the word has roots in colonialism and
Levant is a description of a very specific colonial era where Lebanon, Syria, Palestine were these, and actually it's extended to the north. Jordan and the north of Egypt were trading posts. Alexandria, Jaffa, Gaza, Haifa, you know, like that whole trading post. And it's a word that just gets, I mean, my hair does tend to stand up anyway, but that word tends to do that. There's nothing called the Levant, and there's nothing called Levantine cuisine. Reem just said something fantastic. She said, I celebrate my Syrian and Palestinian cuisine with the hands of my cooks that come from everywhere. Yeah. The words Levantine, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean. I mean, Mediterranean is a more complicated one because that one, there are commonalities with things around them. But basically, Middle Eastern and Levantine for me mean nothing. When we celebrate local produce, I'm celebrating Gaza, I'm celebrating Hebron, I'm celebrating Nablus, Nazareth. I can't talk about oranges if I'm not celebrating the Jaffa orange.
Yeah.
And that's pretty heavy too, right? That's complicated to celebrate that orange right now in this day.
I have a bunch of papers here that are my family's archive, and I'm just finding out more and more how many square meters of land were confiscated from us in 48 that had oranges on them. Mm-hmm. So I decided with this one to use oranges that are not Jaffa oranges because I will not support settlement products, but actually Jaffa is a complicated one, but basically I'll use oranges that are not coming from Jaffa, and I'll still call them Jaffa orange in a dessert. I just did that in a pop-up in London, and if people don't like it, I'm talking about our identity, not about boundaries drawn by history and politicians.
Yeah.
Jaffa is in Israel today? Yes, it is. Whether we agree on a one-state or a two-state solution, whatever, that's another discussion. In de facto on the ground, and I think that's also a difference between the diaspora and us being here, where we're confronted on a daily basis with not only the bad of the realities, but also with the fact that Palestinians are living onwards every day. And they're not living on the hope of a return, which is the reality of people in the diaspora, but rather on, I'm going to make it work tomorrow. I'm going to make whatever reality is, and it's not cool, it's not okay, and it's racist, and it's segregation. And so it's a very different perspective. But for me, what is Palestinian food? It's akub, like the restaurant we're opening up in London, which is a thorn that grows more or less across Palestine, but only celebrated in the north. It's a herb I found about recently, a couple of years ago, called mu'ra, that comes from Nazareth and Tiberias, where me from Bethlehem had never heard of it until a friend somehow had somebody practically smuggle it to Bethlehem. It's like, oh, well, it tastes very close to something called huerna, which grows in Bethlehem, which is hedge mustard, grows in Bethlehem and Jericho. This is Palestine. Yes, there are the totems of Palestinian cuisine, the msakhan, the ma'luba, those enormously dogmatic dishes. But then there's actually everything that goes into a pan or into a little barbecue anywhere across the country, goes into a stew. When we talk, there's a beautiful word in Arabic, and it's not, the origin of the word is not Arabic, it's actually Ottoman, yakhni, which means a stew. What is a yakhni? And I can take a bet with both of you. My mother's yakhni of whatever your mother's and your mother's have nothing to do with each other. Like literally nothing. It's just the idea of a pot with a stew, and that is totally seasonal. But it's not seasonal. When we talk about seasonality in Palestine, people think we're talking about the 4 seasons. We're not. It's the season of bamia, okra, which is 4 weeks. It's the season of, today I actually cooked bamia this morning. And even the farmer who sells me bamia had a bit of a smile. She's like, Fadi, it's the end of the season. They're this big. You should be cooking the ones that are like this. And I was like, well, Khalto, in India, people cook them this big. If you give an Indian a tiny okra, they don't know what to do with it. So, but that's the real beauty of the seasonality of here. So your question of Palestine cuisine 101, I would say get a ticket and come to Palestine and spend the whole year and live every single day of the different season. And maybe then you could grasp what it means. Now, to make it very easy, imagine, you guys are based in the US right now. Imagine a territory that is smaller than your average town in the US. That being a country that has on one side the Mediterranean Sea, with the very, like what we imagine of a Mediterranean landscape, olives, figs, a very dark red soil, and then literally a 2-hour drive, you get to a cliff that goes into the desert of the Jericho Valley and the Jordan Valley, literally in 2 hours. And if you drive up north, you're going towards the Lebanese and Syrian landscapes, but also culture. And if you drive south to Gaza, my uncle's wife is from Gaza. When she speaks, she sounds Egyptian. The dialect is different. And you drive half an hour away from Gaza and you're among the Bedouin communities of the Naqab, which speak a different Palestinian Arabic dialect, cook differently. That is Palestinian cuisine. It is those specificities. And then those specificities that traveled 3 times. That traveled in the late 1800s with the people who've gone, and mainly our communities in places like Chile, like Argentina, like Mexico. There are 600,000 Chileans that are Palestinian origin. Those people traveled in the late 1800s, most of them. Then 1948 and the Nakba, and then 1967. So our cuisine traveled 3 times to 3 very different realities. When Reem's family was in Beirut, they were still in a terroir that was quite similar. It wasn't impossible in Beirut to get, laban for your shish barak. But imagine the guy who left in 1890 to Chile, had only eaten lamb in Palestine and showed up in Chile where there was no lamb. They had to interpret over all of our cuisine and transform it into something based on beef. And then some of it disappeared, and some of it actually got preserved. And that's the beauty of it. There are recipes we lost that you'll find in the US, in Chile, in the diaspora, that you'll find in refugee camps in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, that are still there. So that's Palestinian cuisine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a beautiful. Reem, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I that was a beautiful, thorough 101. Yeah, when I think about Palestinian cuisine, I do think about, for Palestinians, really the food is connected to the land. That's why the land is so important to us. I think about olives and, you know, like all the fruit. I mean, my lineage is from orange citrus groves. In fact, the first story in my cookbook is kind of like a Trojan horse, because the title is How to Host Like an Arab. And it starts with the story of my grandmother witnessing, you know, the takeover of her uncle's citrus grove. And so it's that important to us. And it tells the story. But I think for me, I haven't had that privilege to see that seasonality. I've only known stories about it. And these are stories that surface because I think for a lot of Palestinians who've gone through displacement, there's a sort of amnesia. They don't talk about these things. It's only like, I remember my first discovery of a dandelion green. It was in the late, you know, when I moved to California in the early 2000s, and I shared with my mom, I made this thing that I found at the farm. And she's like, yeah, that's hindbeh. Like, we grew up eating that. I was like, how did I not know that? You know, because she wasn't making dandelion greens in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, where you can't get that, you know. So yeah, the idea of, for me, Palestinian food is about adaptation. That's how I describe it. You know, if you're in Palestine, you're foraging. If you're in the suburbs where there's not good seasonality, you're going to the grocery store and finding whatever frozen foods remind you of Palestine. You know, Palestinian food for me is the food of my grandmother. You know, what she made in her California kitchen, what she made, the stories of what she made in her kitchen, or what she learned from, you know, the friends that she made in the mountains of Lebanon, that she somehow adapted and figured out how to compare it to what she grew up with. But there's a lot of amnesia, and so Palestinians do adapt. I think about some of the privileges I have in diaspora, because the stories I hear in Gaza is that you can't make musakhan with olive oil. There is no olive oil. You have to, you know, you're limited to the rations of aid from the NGOs of canola oil at best. So people are not even making their traditional dishes with the traditional ingredients. So I have a privilege that I'm able to make to confit my chicken in olive oil. So for instance, you know, people in Gaza, they have to travel long ways just to get some fish because their waters are controlled by Israelis. So the fact that I can make a stuffed branzino or a stuffed trout on my side of the ocean is a privilege. So I think for me, I think of Palestinian food more broadly, which is to say nothing makes it less Palestinian just because you're not in that place of origin. And then that is something that I hold dear to me because that is a key to my existence. And if I don't have that, then what do I have? So, you know, it is the stories. It is, you know, I'm just like sitting there listening to Fadi, and I have like, I don't know, I'm choking up, and I have a lot going on deep inside of like, oh, this is so beautiful. And yet it's probably not that beautiful. I'm sure, you know, we were just having a conversation a few weeks ago around bread and wheat and the wheat shortage, and the fact that Palestinians can't grow their own wheat because you need space and you need water, and they have none of that, right? Being in an occupied land. So Sadly, a lot of the diaspora does have a really important role to play, which is to preserve these original recipes and original methodologies in places where we have access to these ingredients and we can localize them, because that is not always the case back in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are both two really beautiful and well thought out sort of rundowns. And I think that should take us really well into something you touch on in your book and something we have all talked about together, which is sort of the importance of food equity, the importance of naming things correctly. Reem, you've had your own journey with that at Reem's in the Bay, in the Mission. And in your book, you discuss it being sort of, in the face of cultural erasure, a form of resistance, which I think is really beautiful. And so I want to talk about why it's important for Palestinian food to be labeled correctly, for it to be called Palestinian food, and historically why that's been so difficult in the States, like why it's so hard, why I've spent so much of my life trying to find it, and it being hidden under colonizer terms like Middle East, Mediterranean, or oftentimes, especially, and I understand the struggle that the generations before us, especially in this country, went through when naming their restaurants or identifying their restaurants. But I think we are seeing more and more people identify correctly, and it's a really wonderful, affirming thing for me to see. It's a really wonderful, affirming thing for me to be able to patronize and be a customer at. And like I said earlier, Reem, it makes me feel at home when I went to your place. And so, Fadi, if you have a view on this, I would love to hear it, because I think it's becoming more and more important.
Look, there's two levels to that. There's the level that should be worldwide generic, which is food provenance. As chefs, we cannot go on ignoring, recognizing food provenance, the hard work of the artisans and the farmers, the sovereignty of land that grows those foods, the importance of preserving the environment. These are all the essence that should be the same thing for chefs, whether you're cooking in Palestinian food in California, Palestinian food in Palestine, Japanese food in Tokyo, whatever. There is an ethic responsibility we have towards not only the produce, but the people that allow us to do what we're doing. In reality, what do Reem and I do? We add a bit of heat, subtract a bit of cold, cut up something, and serve it on a dish. But the people who've done the real work are the farmers, are the artisans, is the guy who's done that olive oil Reem was mentioning, is the the lady who picks and forages ba'la at 4 in the morning. Like, these are the people who are the real heroes. We do not much. We work long hours, and it's not easy to run a restaurant, and we try staff. Fine.
Come on, Fadi. We do something.
Give credit to the people who allow us to do and enjoy what we're doing, actually.
Yes.
So that's absolutely one, which is generic, which is all over the world. Now, for Palestinian cuisine, there's two things that are very difficult as a Palestinian. One is, every time somebody wants to talk to you about Palestinian cuisine, they want to put you always in a binary relation with an Israeli chef. It's like, why? When you're writing about French cuisine, you don't pop up out of a magic box a Swiss chef. When you're writing about, why do I always get this thing that comes out of a magic box? Like, but do you mind giving a conference and having an Israeli present? I'm like, no. You want me to talk about Palestinian food? Why do I need to have an Israeli there? Like, why do I have to have either the recognition given to me by an Israeli, or the let's sell the world the Care Bear, but we can live together story? What we have to remember is this occupation is not about religion. It's not about getting Muslims, Christians, and Jews to live together. It's not about getting Actually, before 1948 and actually before 1920 in Palestine, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Samaritans, and atheists more or less lived together okay, depending on how much the Ottoman Empire wanted to get meddle in or not. There were
Yes.
incidents that weren't great, but they more or less lived together. Actually, in the Arab world, whether we like it or not, there are people of Jewish faith that come from Baghdad and Alexandria and Damascus. So we cannot let this force us to look at things and like be forced every time Reem's gonna write an article about her book, have the next day somebody in the same paper publish an article about from an Israeli chef. You're not obliged to do parody. It's not about parody. It's about celebrating Palestinian food. To stop putting us together like this thing. And so that's one. And the other thing is hummus, frika. They're Arab words. They're Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian. They're not hummus and musabbacha, and they're not Israeli words. They're Palestinian. And enough of having people, the next time I see somebody saying maftoor is Israeli couscous, I think my heart will stop beating. Enough of having, now the trend in London, in New York, in Paris is to have Israeli chefs serve musabbaha. It's on all the menus. And musabbaha is basically warm hummus with full chickpeas together, which you get at every little eatery in Bethlehem, in Nazareth. Like, guys, come on. Like, I don't have a problem that an Israeli chef cooks Palestinian, but say it's Palestinian. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the answer to your question, why it's important, why it's essential for our cuisine. Say Palestinian and then fine, cook it. I have no problem. Cook it and, invent out of it and do whatever you want out of it. The lack of label, actually, I haven't been to Tel Aviv in years, but when I look online, I see all these restaurants being celebrated, Yemeni cuisine, Iraqi cuisine, Moroccan cuisine, and then it seems the word Palestinian burns people's lips, so they can't say. I wouldn't have a problem if there's a restaurant in Tel Aviv run by an Israeli chef that says Palestinian cuisine. Actually, my dream is to find an Israeli who originally was a Palestinian Jew from a family that's a Palestinian Jewish family that says, I'm cooking Palestinian food. I would love to be able to find this because it will mean maybe for all people who believe peace is possible, it'll mean maybe people have started understanding that peace only comes from justice. And that's the moment I think justice will kick in.
This is a loaded question. I mean, I can provide just a little bit of context that, this is, we're always a supporting cast in the Israeli story, and it invisibilizes us. It invisibilizes me, and I talk about this in my book, and it's become the controversial figure, right? I have a blurb, and I had no idea that it was going to be so controversial as to say that hummus is an Arabic word, and that it hurts to my stomach when every time somebody tries my hummus and says it reminds them of Israel, right? That is my experience, and yet people want to make it controversial. I mean, between art, New York, every time that I want to talk about Palestinian cuisine as being Palestinian, I have a political disclaimer on my either the article that's mentioning me or a resume. So this is a very deep, this comes from a very deep entrenched campaign to make it hard for us to normalize that there is Palestinian cuisine, that Palestinian cuisine existed long before the creation of the state of Israel. And it's important to name that because if we don't, then we normalize apartheid. Then we normalize occupation. We normalize this project that is intentionally trying to omit Palestinian cuisine, right? Because our food is our last frontier of existence, right? Like we don't have our land, we don't have our rights, and if you take away our cuisine, then maybe we didn't exist as a people, right? So it's very, very intentional. I think, like Fadi said, it's like become the trend to actually give name to all of the Arab countries that these foods are coming from, with the exception of the very indigenous people who live there. And that's not by coincidence. There are millions of dollars that are poured into the gastro diplomacy, as the Israelis call it, that are targeting, and this is where it relates to the U.S. context, that are targeting very cultural influencers, which are chefs. Whether we like it or not, we are cultural influencers. And let me tell you, to my dismay, they are targeting chefs of color who stand for social justice, who are fighting for, Black lives, who are fighting against, the insane, inhumane immigration systems here in the US, who are fighting for food sovereignty and are taking these free trips to Israel, thinking like, oh, let me just figure out. But in doing so, what they're doing is normalizing this idea that that Israel is a haven, right? We believe in farm to table. Well, how can you do farm to table where, 10 miles outside you have an occupied land and an occupied people, where you're literally kicking people out of their homes that they've lived in for generations, even until today. So there's a real dissonance between people celebrating Palestinian food, but then not actually saying it's a problem that Israeli food is coined as Israeli food with the omission of Palestinians. And I think in my book, I don't really believe in jockeying for ownership. Like, food is fluid, right? We know that. But it is an act of resistance, right? When you claim ownership as a way of conquest and a way of omitting the existence of a people for a political gain, that's where it becomes problematic. And so for me as a Palestinian, naming these foods is not just a way of expressing myself and just celebrating my heritage, although certainly that's a big part of it, right? It's part of my act of my self-determination and liberation. But it's also to call to have, particularly diners here in the US, question. Because in normalizing it, we are participating not only in saying it's okay culturally, but our taxpayer dollars are still paying for that apartheid to exist. So food has become sort of the gateway to open these really hard conversations. And it's not easy, because anytime that you even say that your food is Palestinian, you get coined as anti-Semitic. Like, I'm Semitic. How would I be anti-Semitic
if I may interrupt,
to claim my identity as a Palestinian? So we have to think beyond these polarizing situations of like, all of a sudden we're political. You cannot, in any shape or form, not just as a Palestinian, but as anybody in this country, separate the politics from the food, because there is a political context always in the way that in which we enjoy our food. So yeah, we can either use food for good or use it for bad, and I choose to use it for good.
Fadi, you had we're gonna wrap up.
when Reem just said that she gets called anti-Semitic when she says she's cooking Palestinian food, it just triggered something crazy. When we say to the people you've just described, those American chefs who are in the US defending all social justice values, we say to them, please come and see us without an Israeli accompanying you. You've gone to Israel. I can't force BDS on everybody. I can't force people to not go in Israel, because they will still go. What I can do is say, leave whatever you've been told there and come, because I'm going to tell you that your experience in Jaffa was not what they've sold you, which is a beautifully renovated house with an Israeli cool chef. It's actually my grandfather's house that was stolen in 48. And it's my land. And the orange they've given you, they've been exploiting my oranges for 74 years. illegally. And so you as an American who, and you as that chef, not you, Reem, who believes in the right of property. It's protected in the Constitution of the United States. What is your answer to this? What are you telling me that you've actually had dinner in that place that is mine, that was stolen 74 years ago? And then that's where you see that card of anti-Semitism starting to be pulled out. So it's like, oh, but the Arab countries threw Jews out. And I'm like, yeah, well, you know what? I will help you. Help me raise a case against the state of Israel to get every Palestinian refugee back to their land. And I will help you raise a case against the Egyptians, whoever you want, and go back to whatever country you come from. I am not denying that you're part of those countries. I will never deny this. There's a history of it. But let's be fair. Let's put that in motion. Then they do the thing of, oh, but your leadership in 48 refused the partition. And I'm like, yeah, of course. You stole half of our country. Who in the right mind would agree on, and that's something that, I keep, for some of the people that follow us and know that I happen to be good friends with Muhammad Hadid. People sometimes criticize Muhammad, but Muhammad says the story on and on and on. When Jewish immigrants came to his family's home when he was a little kid in Safad in Nazareth, just before 48, his parents opened the door and let them come in. And then in 1948, that family stole their house.
I just want to add something to this, though, but anti-Semitism is a real thing. So I definitely don't want to create the tropes. It is a real thing. It is a real thing in the Arab world. It is a real thing in the US, and we need to combat it. For me, liberation for Palestine is a liberation for all people. What the state of creation, the state of Israel, what it represents is an exclusionary state for European settlers. So I just want to make sure that is very clear. I believe in a country where all people are equal, that they all have the rights to express their own foodways, and that nobody is treated as a second or third class citizen based on who they are. So I think I believe that is possible, but it's not possible in the context of European settler colonialism, which is the root of all of this. And it's with the aid and abetting of the US, right? And we're seeing that start to tumble. You can't have liberation of one people at the expense of the other. So I think what we're fighting for through our foodways is the liberation for all people.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point, and really it's a very salient, it's a nuanced topic, and I think that's sort of up, which is, Palestinian representation, justice for all, justice for one is justice for all. And I think that's sort of, we're in unity with a lot of different communities. I think with that, we're about to wind down, but we want to hit some questions first. And I just want to thank everyone in the chat for being here and going so hard in the chat and engaging. That's so awesome to see. So the first question we'll go with, and let's try to keep these pretty quick fire, keep it pretty short. I think we're running a bit over. But we have somebody, Carmen Badia Deltel. How do we keep the heritage alive in a globalized world? I think we've sort of talked about a little bit of this, but if we have like a quick response to it, maybe one or two sentences.
Yeah, I'll say quickly, support Palestinian creatives, whether it's in food or media, like that's how we keep it. And with the advent of social media and all of these things, like there's an access to a whole global community. So we definitely need more creatives out there, and for those to support them.
Cool. I'm going to do a couple more. These are pretty fun ones, in my opinion. Cheyenne Salcido. What is a traditional dish we may not see in the main food scene? And I think we'll leave it at that. There's a second part to the question, but I think it would get a little bit. It's like, how do we make it? We don't need to do the recipe right now.
Karshat, tribes, shushbarak, the little Palestinian tortellini, mansa. I mean, I think we don't see 70% of Palestinian cuisine. Just before we went live, Reem and I were talking about a Gaza dish called sumakiya, which is a fantastic dish, which I think nobody really associates even with Palestinian cuisine. So whether it's Reem in her restaurant and in her book and me and all the other great creatives that Reem was mentioning, the chefs, the food writers, today with social media, all the internet cooks, or at least what I call internet cooks, all of these people are contributing to getting those dishes. So it's not one dish, it's a million dishes that are making their way out today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% true. I know for me, like shish barak, I've never seen in the wild. And when it does show up, Reem, you said this in your book, but when it does show up and, if my mom makes it, it's like, no one fuck with her. She made shish barak. It took so long.
Imagine your mother's shish barak is going to be poached in a herb broth and then grilled in an oven and served with a beetroot tahina in my restaurant in London. So I'm taking on barak.
I'm gonna come visit you.
I am very deconstructed.
Oh my God, I love it.
There was this is just a quick story, but I was in there was a Palestinian restaurant in Anaheim called the Olive Tree, and Amo, who was running it, I've been there a bunch. It closed during the pandemic, so don't go to Anaheim trying to find it. But there's a nice Yemeni place there now. But I was there one day, and I was eating like potato obed or just something basic, and which is a funny thing to have on a menu in my mind. I've never seen potato obed outside of just like my breakfast table, and he was there, and I was like, hey, would you ever make shush barak? Would you do it? And he was like, it only catered shush barak, and it'll be very expensive for you. And I was like, okay, so this is what I have to do when I'm not home to get it. All right, so the last question we have, I think is a really fun one. It's from Shreen Khan, a friend of ours. My question is on za'atar. What's the best way to store it? And is there a point that's too old to use? I'm going to go with my opinion first. I don't think there's a point where it becomes too old to use, or maybe, if it's in the freezer. But then again, like I grew up in Nebraska, so like if something came over from a far distance, like we froze that shit and used it forever. I'm sure I've eaten like 2-year-old frozen menaish in my life at some point. Like you freeze everything, and that's what we had to do if we wanted the real shit. But Reem.
Yeah, we go through za'atar by the pounds in my restaurant and in my home. So I have never had za'atar long enough to do that, but maybe Fadi, I don't know. My grandmother froze everything. She freezes her herbs to preserve them. So that would be my answer.
Reem, I live literally 2 minutes away from the guy who does my za'atar.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, like...
And when I travel, I am known to always carry a pouch of za'atar, summa, and olive oil somewhere in my bag. So
oh my God, that's funny. You're so Palestinian.
I'm very Palestinian with
that's
this.
That's like hot sauce in your bag. Za'atar in my bag.
Guys, now the thing you can do with za'atar is honestly, as Reem was saying, and then if you're very far away, freeze it. But if you're lucky to get dry za'atar leaves, actually keep them dry, don't freeze them. Yep. And ground your za'atar yourself. It's not complicated. Yep. It's za'atar leaves, summa, a tiny bit of salt, and then toasted sesame seeds. Those you can get anywhere. As long as you have dried za'atar leaves, I would say just leave those. And those can stay in your pantry for 2 years. No, without
totally.
They don't need freezing. They don't need anything. Just ground it with the summa, the salt, and then add the sesame seed at the end.
Which is a shameless plug to say, don't ever ground your spices until you need to use them. Any of them.
Well, listen, I've really loved this conversation. Reem, Fadi, I always feel so filled with joy and pride when talking and after talking to you guys. So I'm so excited that my day gets to just like start on this note here in LA. And Fadi, hopefully it went well for you and you get to end on a good one. But I think that's it for us today. Before we do sign off, I want to kick it to Antonio or Reem if you have final words, Fadi if you do. But if not, I'll kick it to Antonio. And I just want to thank everyone so much for tuning in, for engaging in the chat, and giving us the opportunity to sort of hear us out and share our voices.
I would say shameless plug if you haven't bought my book, Arabiya is sold wherever books are sold. But also if you just want to follow our work, follow Fadi on Instagram. He's doing amazing work. If you're new to this subject, I encourage you to follow folks like the Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding. They're really good. Craving Palestine. I'm sure there's like a whole other gamut of folks you can follow online, but definitely stay engaged. We need everybody who loves food or works in food, or everybody eats food. So, this connects to us all.
And I was just looking at the chat and I see there's a bunch of people we know, but there's two people I just want to mention because they're very much relevant to everything we're talking about. One is a Palestinian Chilean music band called Diaspora Trio. I mean, how more relevant? Victor Mahana is with us. I saw, like, how more relevant is it? It's Palestinian old music that's been taken to Chile and has gone through a rock version in the last few. I mean, what they're doing is great. And the other person is Nader Maddi. So, okay, we're not supposed to be encouraging people to drink, but I do. Nader Maddi does an artisan arak. He does couple of 1,000 bottles in Bethlehem. I used to hate Ara until I met him, and I've been in love with Ara since then. So these are the creators, Reem, you're talking about, because these are the people we need to support. These are the people that are actually, I think nobody is preserving Palestinian food because Palestinian food is much bigger than all of us, but actually everybody is making it happen, and people like Nader are making it happen.
That's great.
Awesome. Antonio, you have anything to say and take us out?
My God, this was such a incredible conversation. I just want to thank everybody who tuned in from all over the world. It was so beautiful to see the chat come in, everyone chatting from all different parts of the world. This whole conversation, this whole webinar will be available on Life in Time as well. So anybody that didn't get a chance to watch it, it'll be available afterwards. Life in Time is completely member supported. So we're ad free. We're supported only by our readers. So if you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to be part of our community and support conversations like this, so we continue to shed light on communities around the world, please check out lifeintime.com, become a member, please support us. And yeah, thank you so much for everybody. Jibrael, Reem, Fadi, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
All
you.
right, everybody, take care.